The moment my nephew walked in and caught me was a turning point I'll never forget. It all began on an unremarkable, quiet afternoon, one of those lazy, unhurried days when the house felt more like a sanctuary than just a living space. Golden sunlight poured through the blinds, casting soft, fragmented beams on the walls and furniture. Outside, a gentle breeze nudged the branches of the old oak tree, its rustling leaves blending faintly with the distant hum of traffic. The house seemed to exist in its own timeless bubble, suspended in a dreamlike stillness. Evan had stepped out earlier to run errands, a quick trip to the grocery store, he'd said with his usual dependable grin. While I appreciated his help around the house, I also cherished these moments of solitude. They were rare, fleeting windows of time when the quiet seemed to wrap around me like a familiar embrace. I had been lounging on the couch, flipping through the channels in search of something to hold my attention. Nothing did. My mind drifted, untethered, and a strange restlessness bubbled beneath my skin. Sighing, I stretched my arms as if the simple act could shake off the unease. But the feeling clung to me, stubborn and persistent, refusing to let go. Eventually, I got up, my footsteps echoing softly as I wandered through the house. Moving seemed to ease some of the tension, though not entirely. Without really thinking, I found myself in the bedroom, drawn there by some unspoken need. The familiar surroundings welcomed me, the soft duvet draped over the bed, the faint scent of lavender lingering on the pillowcases, and the dim light filtering through the curtains. The room had always been my retreat, a place where the chaos of the outside world couldn't reach me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers brushing absently over the comforter as I gazed out the window. The stillness returned, but instead of calming me, it sparked something deeper, a faint urge, like the distant rumble of thunder before a storm. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible tug within me. But with each passing second, it grew stronger, more insistent. I exhaled slowly, trying to ground myself, but the tension only coiled tighter, winding through me like a live wire. My skin tingled, a warmth spreading over me even though the room remained cool. Shifting on the bed, I felt my heart begin to race, my breaths becoming shallow and uneven. My thoughts began to wander, slipping into places they shouldn't have gone. Images and sensations I'd tried to suppress came rushing back, vivid and unbidden. I traced my fingers down my thighs, the smooth fabric of my leggings heightening the sensations coursing through me. The outline of my legs, the soft curve of my waist, it all felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, yet intensely mine. A shiver ran through me as I leaned back against the pillows, my eyes fluttering shut. The warmth inside me deepened, radiating through my chest and pooling in my stomach. Time seemed to dissolve, the house and everything within it fading into the background. It was just me and the rush of sensations flooding my senses, drowning out everything else. My fingers moved with a mind of their own, brushing over my skin with a tenderness that felt both new and achingly familiar. A soft sigh escaped my lips, the sound almost startling in the stillness of the room. And then, like a jolt of lightning cutting through the haze, I heard the front door open. My body froze, every nerve on high alert as the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the house. For a moment, I thought I could ignore it, pretend it hadn't happened. But then came the unmistakable voice, clear and sharp, "Auntie, I'm back." The rustle of grocery bags followed his words, and my heart slammed into my ribs, panic crashing over me. I turned my head toward the door, and my stomach dropped. It was wide open. For half a second, I clung to the desperate hope that maybe he hadn't seen anything, that I could recover before he realized what was happening. But then his footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. When I finally looked up, there he was, standing in the doorway, a grocery bag dangling from his hand. His expression was frozen in shock, his eyes wide as they took in the scene before him. Time seemed to stretch unbearably thin, each second dragging out as I watched the flicker of realization cross his face. I didn't mean to," Evan stammered, his voice rushed and uneven. He took a small step back, his gaze still locked on me. But his expression began to shift. The initial shock gave way to something else, something I couldn't quite name. Curiosity, maybe. Or intrigue? The air between us grew thick, almost suffocating, as if the weight of the moment had compressed everything around us. My mind raced, scrambling for what to do. Should I cover myself? Apologize? Say something to break the tension? The conflicting emotions crashing through me, embarrassment, panic, a lingering thrill, left me paralyzed. Evan cleared his throat, finally averting his gaze. I'll put these away, he mumbled, holding up the bags as if to remind himself of why he was here. Sorry, Auntie. I didn't mean to. I'll just give you some space. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps retreating far too quickly. The silence that followed was oppressive. My body still buzzed with residual heat, but now it was laced with something darker, shame, confusion, a sense of exposure that I couldn't shake. Yet, beneath all of it, there was something else, a strange, undeniable spark that left me breathless. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering as the scene replayed in my mind. The image of him standing there, his expression a mix of emotions I couldn't fully decipher, was burned into my memory. His eyes, the way they lingered just a moment too long, sent a shiver through me. But he was my nephew. I couldn't let this moment define us. Taking a deep breath, I stood and made my way toward the kitchen, the sound of cabinets opening and closing growing louder as I approached. Evan was busy unpacking groceries, his movements deliberate and methodical, as if focusing on the task might erase what had just happened. I hesitated in the doorway, watching him for a moment. The tension in the air was palpable, a living, breathing thing between us. Clearing my throat softly, I stepped into the room. His shoulders tensed at the sound, but he didn't turn around. "Hey," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression carefully neutral, though I could see the edge of discomfort in his eyes. "Just finishing up with the groceries," he said quickly, turning back to the counter. "Thanks," I replied, taking another step closer. I tried to sound casual, as if nothing had changed, but we both knew that wasn't true. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, until finally he spoke. About earlier, his voice was softer now, hesitant. "I didn't mean to walk in on you." Heat rose to my cheeks again, and I instinctively crossed my arms, trying to shield myself from the weight of the memory. "It's fine," I said quickly, though my voice betrayed my nerves, pitched higher than I intended. Evan closed the fridge and turned to face me, his eyes locking with mine. This time, his expression wasn't one of shock or embarrassment. Instead, it carried something else entirely, something I couldn't quite name. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice lower now, softer. "I was just surprised, that's all." My breath hitched. It wasn't just his words, it was the way he was looking at me, as though he was trying to read the very thoughts I was trying to hide. That gaze, it felt different, unsettling yet magnetic. That night as I lay in bed, the memory replayed in my mind, vivid and inescapable. My skin felt as though it were on fire, every nerve alive and raw. I told myself I shouldn't feel this way, that this pull, this uncontrollable urge to revisit the moment, was wrong. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept returning to him. To the details of his expression, the intensity in his eyes. My heart ached as though caught in some invisible grip, an undeniable force I couldn't escape. I told myself it was nothing more than a fleeting emotional surge, something that would fade with time. But deep down, I knew better. That charged atmosphere between us, something that should have felt safe and familiar, now lingered as an unsettling presence, haunting me. The distance between us, the unspoken shift, was impossible to ignore. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the floor. The house was quiet, as it always was, but something about the stillness felt foreign now. What had once been a sanctuary, a comforting space filled with routine and family, had become unfamiliar, tinged with an unnameable tension. I got out of bed, my heart still racing for reasons I couldn't entirely explain. Today I knew I couldn't avoid this any longer. Whatever had shifted between Evan and me, it wasn't going to disappear on its own. I had to face it, even if I didn't know how. Moving through the house, I tried to lose myself in mundane tasks, cleaning, making coffee, arranging the kitchen. These routines had always grounded me before, but now they felt hollow, meaningless. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with something unsaid. Every small noise, every subtle movement seemed amplified, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Evan and I barely spoke that morning. We passed each other in the kitchen, exchanging only a few polite words about breakfast. But the silence that stretched between us was deafening. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace, it was the kind that carried the weight of things unspoken. Every glance, every moment spent in the same room felt charged, the tension swirling like a storm on the horizon. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on anything but him, but it was no use. His presence filled the space, his quiet movements impossible to ignore. Should I confront him? Pretend nothing had happened? The questions circled endlessly in my mind, their weight pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. At some point, I found myself back in the kitchen, preparing a meal I wasn't even hungry for. My hands moved mechanically, chopping and stirring without thought, while my mind raced. I could feel him enter the room before I saw him. His silence was louder than any words, and it gnawed at me. When I glanced over my shoulder, our eyes met for just a moment. It was fleeting, but in that brief connection, I saw the same confusion, the same hesitation I felt. And yet, there was something else, something darker, lurking beneath the surface. The air between us grew thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. I turned back to the counter, gripping it tightly as if it could ground me. I don't know what to say, I muttered, the words barely audible, unsure if I was speaking to him or to myself. Evan stepped closer, his movements deliberate but careful, as though he was trying not to startle me. My pulse quickened despite myself. He didn't touch me, didn't speak right away, but his presence was overwhelming. The space between us felt like it was closing in, shrinking until there was nowhere else to go. I didn't mean to make things weird, he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. I shook my head quickly, though the words I wanted to say were tangled somewhere deep inside. It's not bad, it's just. I don't know what to make of it, I admitted, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay composed. You've been different around me, Evan, and I can't ignore that. He exhaled slowly, as though trying to steady himself. I haven't been the same around you either, he confessed, his tone tinged with something raw and vulnerable. I don't know what's happening, but I can't just pretend it isn't. I turned away again, my hands gripping the counter even tighter. The cold surface beneath my palms was the only thing keeping me from spiraling. We can't, I whispered. This isn't something we can just ignore. I know, he said quietly. His voice carried an urgency that made my chest tighten, but there was also a softness to it, a plea I couldn't dismiss. I think we need to talk about it. Whatever this is, we can't just leave it hanging between us. My eyes closed, shutting out the sight of him as if that could somehow dull the overwhelming tide of emotions threatening to drown me. But there was no escape, not from this, not from him, not from the weight of what had happened and what might come next. I don't know how to fix this, I admitted, my voice barely audible. Evan moved closer still, until the heat of his presence seemed to radiate through the room. We don't have to fix it, he said gently, firmly. We just have to be honest, with each other and with ourselves. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat. I don't know if I can, I said, my voice breaking under the strain of the truth. I'm scared. His eyes softened, though there was a determination there that sent a shiver through me. It's okay to be scared, he said quietly. But I need you to trust me. The world seemed to shrink around us, the rest of the house fading into the background as his words settled over me. My heart pounded in my chest, every nerve alive with the intensity of the moment. I wanted to believe him, to let go of the fear and uncertainty that held me captive. But could I? I don't know how to do this, I whispered, my voice barely audible, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile moment we were sharing. Evan didn't respond immediately, but I felt his hand tighten slightly around mine, a reassuring gesture that spoke louder than words. We don't have to figure it all out right now, he said softly. His voice was steady, but there was a gentleness to it that wrapped around my frayed nerves like a balm. His words offered comfort, but doubt still lingered in the corners of my mind. What were we doing? Where was this leading? Every instinct I had screamed to step back, to preserve the safety of what we'd always had. And yet, a deeper, quieter part of me didn't want to let go. I don't want to hurt you, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I don't want to ruin whatever this is. Evan's eyes softened as he tilted his head slightly, studying me with a sincerity that made my heart ache. You won't hurt me, he replied, his tone firm but kind. And we're not ruining anything. We're just figuring things out. His words carried an assurance that I couldn't quite summon in myself. But uncertainty clawed at the edges of my resolve, making my thoughts swirl. It feels like we're standing on the edge of something, I admitted, my breath shallow. I just don't know if it's a bridge or a cliff. Evan exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking down to where our hands were intertwined before returning to meet mine. I don't know either, he said quietly. But whatever this is, it doesn't feel wrong. His words landed with a weight I wasn't prepared for. They settled deep in my chest, stirring something I'd been trying to deny. He was right, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. It doesn't feel wrong, I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. But it does feel like we're crossing a line. Evan didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he met my gaze with an openness that made my chest tighten. Sometimes, he said, his voice quiet but certain, crossing a line is the only way to get to where we're supposed to be. I think we're meant to figure this out together. His words resonated, their truth impossible to ignore. I wanted to resist, to pull back, to cling to the simplicity of how things had been before. But that part of me, the part that had been drawn to him from the start, knew we were already in too deep. I'm scared, I admitted, more to myself than to him. What if we can't figure it out? What if we ruin everything? Evan's thumb brushed over the back of my hand, his touch slow and steady, grounding me. I'm scared too, he said, his voice raw with honesty. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you. His vulnerability left me breathless. It was as if he'd offered me a piece of himself, trusting me to hold it gently, and for a moment, the weight of it was overwhelming. But then I realized that I didn't want to let go, not of him, not of this. I don't know what's going to happen, I said softly. But I know I can't walk away from this. A small, uncertain smile curved his lips, and he nodded as though my words were all the reassurance he needed. Then we don't have to. We'll figure it out together. The world seemed to still around us, the quiet of the house wrapping us in its embrace. It was just us now, nothing else mattered. His hand tightened around mine, a silent promise that neither of us would face this alone. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step closer, pulling me with him. I didn't resist. I couldn't. The space between us dissolved, leaving only the warmth of his presence and the quiet certainty that whatever this was, it was ours to navigate. My heart pounded in my chest, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the thrill of stepping into something new, something fragile but exhilarating. I think, I started, my voice faltering slightly, I think we're doing the right thing, even if I'm not sure what comes next. Evan's gaze softened, his lips curving into a faint smile. Reaching up, he gently brushed a stray lock of hair from my face, his touch tender and deliberate. You're not alone in this, he whispered, his words hovering in the air between us. We're in this together. Whatever it is. The tension that had been building between us seemed to snap, not in chaos, but in clarity. Slowly, he leaned in, and before I could overthink it, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was tentative at first, a quiet exploration, as though we were testing the waters of something neither of us fully understood. But then it deepened, slow and deliberate, born of every unspoken moment we'd shared. It wasn't just a kiss, it was an unspoken agreement, a step forward into the unknown. When we finally broke apart, breathless and wide-eyed, I saw the same vulnerability in his gaze that mirrored my own. Neither of us had the answers. Neither of us knew what came next. But we both knew this. There was no going back. "This changes everything," I said softly, my voice trembling with both fear and hope. Evan nodded, his expression serious but gentle. "It does. But I don't want to go back. Not now. Not after this." Relief washed over me, mingling with the warmth of his words. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel uncertain. Whatever the future held, I knew I wanted to face it with him. "We'll take it one step at a time," I said, my voice steadier now, though my fingers still trembled slightly in his. "And we'll keep this just between us for now." Evan's smile widened, and he gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "Just between us," he agreed. "We'll figure it out when the time is right." In that moment, I knew we didn't need to have all the answers. What mattered was that we had each other. And as we stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, the rest of the world faded away. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together, one step at a time.